The Bird Emergency, the podcast focusing on the rare, endangered, threatened birds of the world and the people who are doing something about saving them, protecting them, stopping the loss. The subject of today's show is a birder, ecologist and conservationist, a PhD candidate at Murdoch University in Perth, investigating the behaviour, feeding and general ecology and life history of fairy terns in an effort to better inform the conservation and the management of the species. My guest is also the inaugural mention in the new segment, The Honour Roll, shortlisted in the Australian, New Zealand, Antarctica, New Guinea Bio Group Nature Photographer of the Year 2020, connecting science with the arts to shine a spotlight on fairy terns. So many of you, particularly in Western Australia, might now have an idea who today's guest is. Now, if you would like to be mentioned in the honour roll or know somebody who should be, somebody who's been given a gong, got a new job, got a promotion, recently graduated, anything along those lines, in the bird world, in the ornithology field, or just general conservation, stick around to the end of the episode for the details of how to do that. And today it's my pleasure to introduce Claire Greenwell, who is working in Western Australia on the fairy tern. Claire, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Thanks so much.
I would imagine that very few people have seen a fairy tern, or if they have, that they've really recognised what they've seen. Is there a bird that can escape detection?
Yeah, I think probably you're right there, particularly for people on the eastern states. We have a large birding community here in Western Australia, and we also have a very large population of fairy terns. So anyone that's in the birding world probably sees fairy terns each breeding summer here in WA. But over on the east coast, the birds are much more rare and their populations have been declining in recent decades. So people over there perhaps may be less inclined to be able to spot them each breeding season.
What niche does the fairy tern occupy?
So fairy terns are typically what we know as a beach nesting birds. They occupy a range of different habitats. So you could see them on inland salt lakes, islands, for example. So Rottnest Island is a good example. Beaches, but also limestone, and also in the lower reaches of estuaries on islands. But typically wide sandy beaches is kind of their main type of habitat that they prefer.
Now, being a tern, they're a seabird, but as you've lightly touched on, that their nesting is on shore,
yes.
I imagine on sandy beaches. Is it a bird that spends most of its life at sea, or does it come and roost on land, on shore?
Yeah, so there's two types of seabirds. You've got the pelagic birds, which usually spend most of their time at sea and only come back to the land to breed, whereas the fairy tern is a coastal breeder. And so they are inshore foragers. They are foraging close to shore. They come back and they roost on shore or on islands each night. So they're much easier to see and they're much easier to be able to study.
The fairy tern is very similar to the little tern in Australia here. Are they direct competitors? Do they have a slightly different niche in the ecosystem? And are they both confined in their range to Australia, or are they a wide-ranging global species?
So functionally they are probably largely the same.
Well, in the interest of accuracy, Claire gave me a tap on the shoulder, figuratively, on Twitter and said, "Hey, I need to say something a bit better." And I'd asked Claire the question about whether the little tern and the fairy tern occupied the same niche or whether they were direct competitors. Now, Claire, you said you wanted to clarify what you'd originally told me. So let's go.
Okay, so I guess I wanted to just clarify the point that while these birds do have some overlap in their distribution, particularly in the recent decades, they do have some quite distinct differences, and largely, I think, looking at the diet. So fairy terns are predominantly piscivores, which means that they eat fish. They do also eat some small squids, which I've discovered through my research. But the little terns actually are known to eat quite a large proportion of crustaceans and mollusks, as well as even insects. So they are able to distinguish their diets a bit and have some resource partitioning, which would allow them to occupy, I guess, the same areas, but not overlap.
So that tells me that one is more likely to be feeding in the littoral zone and the other one is more likely to be spending nearly all of its time feeding at sea on the water.
Well, I guess one of the things that we know about fairy terns is that they're described as blue water terns. So having that really clear water where they can go out foraging and look for, bait fishes that are close to the surface.
And the little terns more likely to be alighting perhaps on rock pools and whatnot and foraging there.
Yeah, and they could be in a much broader range of habitats, I guess, than the fairies.
I think that clears that up pretty well, Claire.
Great. I just wanted to point that out. Thank you.
Look, you're an academic and you're all about accuracy, and that's what we love.
Oh, no, I think it's important.
Me too. Well, now we can go back to the show.
Excellent. If we talk about fairy terns, we've got the Australian subspecies of fairy tern, but then going further afield, you've got the New Zealand subspecies and also the subspecies from New Caledonia. And they're all distinct, but they have basically the same ecology. And then the little terns, they're much more global. There are two subspecies that come to Australia, and on the east coast you've got the breeding, and actually you have intermixing between fairy terns and little terns, so you've got mixed colonies. But in Western Australia, particularly on the south, on the lower west coast, we don't see the little terns, but the little terns do breed sort of high up on the coast above Exmouth.
Does that mean that they are also making use of the tropics?
Probably a bit of both. So we know about fairy terns. We've just finished some research which shows that we have a sedentary population of fairy terns in the Pilbara, and they breed during the winter months. And then we've also got this semi-migratory population, and they breed during the spring and summer. And a large proportion of those birds comes down to the lower west coast over those months. And then I guess it's the same on the east coast with fairy terns. You've got them breeding at the same time of year during spring and summer.
Is the population from the west to the east or reaches of Australia, is that a contiguous population, or is it a number of broken populations?
So from the records that we see of fairy terns, we see that there are some broken records. And with fairy terns, it's probably, this is another piece of research that we're just about to reveal, is that we have these management units of fairy terns, and those management units consist of clusters of birds which aggregate in different regions. There might be intermixing between the different colonies. And so we've got that distinct clustering of birds on the west coast, and then you've got the population in South Australia and Victoria and then Tasmania. Whether or not there's how much intermixing between those different populations, we're not certain of. But there was a research study done a few years ago by a New Zealand researcher, and she was particularly interested to see whether there was any distinction in the genetic structure of fairy terns between the three subspecies, which there is. But she also found that there were there was enough mixing between generations from the East Coast and the West Coast to suggest that there is no difference genetically.
It's one species, but one distinct subspecies.
One distinct subspecies, but I think probably largely we have a separation because of the Great Australian Bite. You may get individuals, small numbers moving between the southeast and the west, and we have got a few records of birds kind of in the middle, so you're not sure which way they're going, but I guess her evidence would suggest that there is some exchange going on.
And as the work on genetics for populations occurs over time, it's possible that they'll be split into two species. Is that where you think it might be heading?
That's right. Yeah. It's possible. This topic has just been reviewed, and we don't have enough evidence at the moment to suggest that they are distinct. But as methods improve over time, it is possible that new insights will be found and they will be split off. But at this stage, we can't say either way definitively.
Well, you mentioned, Claire, that you're undertaking a PhD and that there's some work that you're about to put out there. Can you give us an idea of how your project came about and what the aims of it are and what the limitations are?
Sure. So when I was looking for a PhD project, I wanted to find something with really strong conservation values. I had indicated to my honours supervisor, who is a fantastic person to work with, who I wanted to continue my work with, that I was interested in working on seabirds. And he introduced me to Nick Dunlop, who's been working on terns and other seabirds here in Western Australia for probably over 40 years. So I met with Nick and we talked about the potential projects that he had going, and one of them was on the fairy tern, and that really appealed to me. There were a range of things, I guess, that ticked my boxes that I thought would be really good, and potentially the possibility of actually having really strong outcomes and inputs into the way that species are managed. So I guess, that's really exciting for me. And one other component which I found quite interesting is we've got the Fairy Tern Conservation Network. I had the opportunity essentially to work with a number of people who were really already strongly interested in fairy terns, and together we could hopefully deliver better outcomes for these birds.
How much do we already know about the fairy terns, Claire?
So I guess a lot of information has been collected over the years just from general birding. People are, doing their own ornithological research. And we have general information about these birds, but there's never been a detailed study into this species. There's been a few studies on the New Zealand subspecies because they are so threatened. That subspecies is down to about 40 birds, 10 breeding pairs, so that's really small. So they're kind of interested in ways that they can try and obviously boost breeding success. Maybe what we're seeing over there is confounded by the fact that they've got really small population size, so it might not be what's realistic in a larger population.
What's causing the I nearly made an assumption there. I'm assuming that the population of the fairy tern has been declining. Do we know if it has been declining? And if it has, do we know what the principal reasons for that are?
We do. So the fairy tern has definitely been declining, particularly in the eastern states, New Zealand. We're not too sure about New Caledonia and West Australia. For Western Australia, some of the early records that we have of fairy terns were confused with probably roseate terns. But certainly the reason that a species gets listed as threatened is because there is a decline in the population over the decades. So we know for fairy terns that there's been a 24% decline in the population in 3 breeding generations up until 2007. And so that resulted in Australian population being listed as threatened. Now, some of the main threatening processes are obviously their ecology. They nest on beaches, and we have huge conflicts on beaches because of human recreation. We also use those spaces. In Western Australia particularly, we have had a lot of coastal development. So many of their former nesting areas are no longer available. In South Australia, there was a collapse of food in the Coorong. So that was one of the primary factors to the loss of large numbers of birds over there. But, you can think about just their ecology being on the beach and what they have to go through to be able to get their chicks through a nesting season. You've got, one summer storm that comes through can wipe out an entire colony of birds and ruin an entire nesting attempt. So they are quite vulnerable.
How long does a fairy tern generally live?
So last year I actually found an injured fairy tern on the beach, and it was actually banded. The bird was banded by my supervisor back in 1997. So the bird was almost 23 years old, and that's the current longevity record for the species. In the year before, we actually recorded 2 birds at a colony down in Mandurah, and they were just shy of 22. So these birds are living for a long time, but they do have years where they're not successful in their breeding. But if you can have successful colonies and ensure that they continue to have successful years, we can make sure that these birds continue to thrive.
If a pair have a successful breeding season, is it just one clutch that they're likely to rear, and what's the average size of a clutch?
Yeah, so fairy terns, their clutch is 1 to 3 eggs. 3 eggs is really rare, so usually 1 to 2. That's probably largely dependent on food availability, so how many bait fish are around in the area, but also if that bird has nested before. So probably birds that are more experienced are maybe better at foraging. They have potentially experience with a past partner, and so they can come into reproductive condition sooner, which would allow them to lay larger eggs as well as larger clutches.
Is it only one clutch a year? Like, are there cases where they can double up on a really good year?
Yeah, so fairy terns and other terns, they only will have one clutch a year. Post-parental care is really, really important in terns, and the fairy terns and other terns, they care for their chicks for long periods of time after fledging. We know that feeding continues for at least 3 months post-fledging because we've got lots of records of that happening. So there would be no way that a tern would be able to rear a second clutch in the same season. Plus, once the terns have hatched chicks, you'll start to see the birds regress in their plumage state. So there's a change in the hormones, and you'll start to see the bill blackening, and then they'll start to lose that jet black head cap. So that's a fundamental physical change or physiological change that goes on in the body, which would not allow them to be able to re-nest again. If they do lose a clutch early on in the season, they do have the potential to relay.
Are they close to shore feeders, or do they range, far out to sea?
They are close to shore foragers. So if you think about fairy terns during the breeding season, they are required to bring fish back to the colony for their mates and for their chicks. So the males feed the females during the breeding season, particularly during the egg production phase, and that feeding, I would suggest, probably goes directly to egg production. Once the eggs are laid, the males will continue to feed the females, but less frequently. And then once the chicks hatch, they continue to feed the chicks until they fledge, and then they'll move elsewhere. So while they're having to do all that, they have to basically find food and bring it back to the colony. It would be energetically expensive for them to go and travel large distances to basically bring back one fish. So fairy terns are known as single prey loaders, which basically means carrying a single fish at any one time. And they bring those fish back to the colony, as I mentioned.
Everyone, certainly in Australia and probably in the New Zealand and Pacific region, will be aware of the ubiquitous seagull, the silver gull, and its various incarnations. How big is a fairy tern compared to a seagull?
In terms of body size, they're probably about a third of the size, but maybe half the wingspan. Silver gulls are a significant problem for fairy terns. I had a really insightful experience this year working on Penguin Island, where we had one gull that was a persistent predator of the chicks. As the chicks were hatching, he was knocking them off, which was really hard to watch. But I guarded the colony as much as I could because I was trying to investigate their diet. So I needed to collect as much information as I could. At the end of the breeding season, the gulls actually worked out that they could start parasitizing fish from the chicks. So they would stand on the outskirts of the colony. When the adults brought in a fish, they would locate where the fish was heading to, and they would swoop in and steal the fish off the chicks. So that was a real problem. And then even further into the season, they started depredating the eggs. So any birds nesting at the end, they kind of all got cleaned up.
We briefly touched on the threats that are present for the fairy tern, and you mentioned the population collapse in the Coorong. And when we think of shore nesting birds, I can think of, obviously there's people walking along the beach, and there's the dogs, and then there's horse riding, and there's four-wheel driving, and you mentioned storms. But I don't think people would think of cotton growing and irrigation in Western Queensland and Western New South Wales as being a threat to any of our shorebirds. But that's simply what happened in the Coorong, wasn't it?
That's right.
The lack of water, the water flow in the Murray-Darling system caused that whole estuarine complex in the Coorong to collapse for a couple of years, and that's seabirds.
It is, and it's so complex. What you do at one end of a system, it fundamentally can change the whole system. So it's really important that we're managing these environments to ensure that
they talk about basin-wide management, but I often think that the whole catchment mentality, which I don't think has been a bad thing, I still don't think that the tentacles of the examinations have been wide enough.
I agree with you there.
Do you know how that South Australian population has bounced back? I mean, it's still a long way from where you're doing your work, but are you aware of any recovery there?
I wouldn't say that they've bounced back. Obviously, I'm not working over there, but, their numbers have crashed significantly. So I think it would take quite some time for that population to rebuild. And it would be important to have these measures in place where you can ensure that you're boosting reproductive success. So one of the things that we're trialling here in Western Australia is the use of managed sites. And managed sites are essentially creative artificial areas that you can use, that they can be fenced off and to support breeding birds to give them the best possible chance of success. We've got one site which you never would think a fairy tern would breed there, but it's in the bustling Fremantle port where you've got trucks going past every 5 to 10 seconds. But the area was the most successful breeding area for fairy terns for a number of years, and they didn't nest there last year, but the 2 previous seasons we had around 200 to 250 birds nesting there. So it's quite a significant site for fairy terns in Western Australia.
Now, had they been lost from that site and then they've found it again once it was intensively managed, or has there been a population on that site hanging on before the management intervention?
Yeah, so the fairy terns have been trying to nest there for years. It's a historically important area. If you think about one of the things that fairy terns like is estuaries. You've got a lot of nutrients coming out of those estuaries, and so that creates productivity. So you've got also a lot of bait fish. So where you've got lots of bait fish, that's a good area for fairy terns. So the fairy terns had been nesting there, well, at least attempting to nest there for many years, but we had records of four-wheel drives driving straight through the middle of the colony. One year there was a grader that went straight through the colony. people with dogs, fishing, all sorts of recreational activities, and unfortunately they weren't very successful. Some of the land was cleared to build a new shipping container yard, and the fairy terns started nesting there, and they basically held up port development. And so the Fremantle ports then recognised the need to create a nesting area for fairy terns. And so collaborating with BirdLife Australia as well as the Conservation Council of WA, but large inputs from the Western Australian Museum, they created this new site for the fairy terns, the Rousehead Fairy Tern Sanctuary. And the site was used by the terns for 6 years concurrently. And as I mentioned, it was a very, very successful site. But then last year was the first year they skipped a season. So we didn't see any nesting there, despite the birds coming and having a look and people getting very excited thinking that we'd have a colony there.
Have you got any idea why they didn't nest there, and if any of those regular individuals at that site managed to breed at a different site?
Being a small tern, you're subject to a range of threats, and predators is always an important consideration about when you're going to lay a clutch of eggs and where you're going to lay a clutch of eggs. And over time, it's likely that colonies become quite predictable to predators. So we think probably that not nesting in a particular location for too long helps to reduce the potential risks from predation. Also, it could be due to other factors such as food availability. But at the Point Walter site where I work in the river, we changed some fencing that we had there. So the land managers actually shifted the fencing about 50 metres towards the land side, and that created a bit more space on the islet where the birds could do all their courtship and, what terns do, hanging out on the beach, roosting. And actually where the fence used to start is the location of the new colony that we had there. So we went from having about 70, 75 pairs in the previous breeding season to having about 130 to 140 pairs this year. So it was really successful. Unusually, the terns nested amongst some vegetation there, which is quite unusual for fairy terns. They typically like sandy substrates, but I think the lack of area that was above the high tide mark forced them to be nesting on some of the native couch grass and some other low-lying vegetation. But actually, and quite interestingly, they did modify the substrate. So it appears that in most cases they dug their little scrapes into the grass and cleared the vegetation and laid their eggs directly onto the sand.
That seems like they're reasonably adaptable, if I can assume that, and that they must have within their own experience and their memory a couple of nesting sites that they're aware of if they're utilising a strategy where every couple of years they miss out at one site as a strategy to avoid predation. So that's pretty nifty. I wouldn't have thought that was occurring. So that's a bit of a nugget.
Yeah, so I'll just go into some detail on that. So we've been doing a colour banding project for a number of years, and from the colour bands, we've actually noticed that birds have quite a high rate of exchange between colonies. So within a particular region, you might have, depends on where you are, but in the Perth breeding region, we've got Point Walter, which is in the river. We've got Rousehead. We've got several offshore islands. There's a coastal lake that they breed on. So there's a number of sites, and we know that the birds actually go between those sites. So each day or each week, there's no doubt that fairy terns will be going around and they'll be assessing all the different types of habitats. And their site selection about where they lay an egg will be based on past experience there. Is there food there? Are my friends there potentially? So there's a range of factors that they'll be assessing. Am I going to get cleaned up by high tide? So making sure that it's high enough. So, yeah, there's a range of considerations, I guess, that they will be looking at before they decide where they're going to breed. And because of that, we do get interchange between the colony sites. So not all birds will always nest at the same site every year, and there can actually be quite large movements between colonies between years.
That's pretty cool. It suggests that they're probably quite adaptable if they have food available and that the sites can be secured. Now, you talked about maybe they're assessing if their friends are there. Are they a highly sociable bird?
They are. And one thing that we've actually discovered from the banding records is that we have these, what appears to be associations of birds that have been nesting together over multiple seasons. So this is pretty common in the common tern, and a long-term study showed that over time that those associations of birds and the tendency for birds to nest together became stronger. And so we think that this is probably also going on for fairy terns in WA, and it could be happening for the birds in the east as well. That's a really important consideration. So you've got birds that nest in these ephemeral habitats where they're not necessarily going to have that same habitat available each year, but the fact that these birds have these associations and that they potentially nest with a certain group of birds, that might allow for birds to establish colonies more quickly.
Is there? I'm really drawing a long bow here, but is there any studies that have been done about the way that the colonies and the individuals within them interact? And I'm thinking, are there perhaps birds that have different roles, like maybe scouts and protectors and things like that? Because it sounds like that there's some information sharing going on within and between the different colony groups.
Yeah, I would say that there's no scouts or any of that type of behaviour. Nobody's looking out for anybody else. They're just worried about themselves. But what you see at colonies is you've got a lot of birds coming and going. They're not all in the same breeding state. So you'll have your birds that have already laid their eggs, but then you get birds that are still in their eclipse plumage, or you've got young birds and they're coming and they're assessing the colony. So they're trying to gain information about the success of that colony from other birds, and that helps them to decide where is going to be a good place for me to lay my eggs when the time comes. They may not necessarily lay eggs there in that year. You know, they might be young birds and they're just getting a feel for the landscape. But for other birds that are going to breed, the success of a colony is probably one of the large drivers of why a bird would choose a particular site, and actually having birds in the same reproductive condition. So from some of my work, we see that we get these little clusters of birds forming. And so at any one time, you've got birds that are potentially have chicks, and then in another area of the colony, you've got birds that are still laying. So you can have a whole range of birds in different reproductive states at any one time. And obviously that would depend on the size of the colony. And I work on quite large colonies, so they are quite protracted in their laying periods.
So the colonies that you're doing your work in, Claire, are they exclusively fairy terns, or will
they are?
Do you know of any other colonies in Australia where they will tolerate other species hanging out with them at breeding time?
Oh, they're pretty aggressive for a little bird. I have seen red-cap plovers on Rottnest Island breeding on the outskirts of a fairy tern colony, but they're pretty small birds and, you know, they're non-threatening. So they seem to tolerate them. I know I think it was Bird Island in South Australia, they nested quite close to a Caspian tern colony. So maybe they think Caspian terns will be the shepherds and ward off any gulls lurking. You know, I wouldn't be surprised if the odd chick goes missing to a Caspian tern.
I'm going to jump back to the similarities between the little tern and the fairy tern. Are they competitors for breeding locations, or do they breed in a different ecological niche?
So on the East Coast, there are records of fairy terns and little terns nesting together. So I guess they do compete. From what I've seen about little terns, and I don't know little terns like I do fairy terns, their nests are much more spaced. So, you know, you might have 10 metres between a little tern nest, whereas some of my colonies, I've got nests, the nearest neighbour was about 30 centimetres. So they're pretty close. And the average nest spacing is about 0.75 of a metre. So it's pretty close, but that can range up to hundreds of metres depending on location. So, yeah, in terms of, or in answering your question, they do occupy the same habitats. So I guess there would be some competition for space.
Predation, we talked about the effect of gulls. In the WA colonies that you've been working with, foxes and cats and dogs are significant predators?
Not so much dogs. We're kind of at a stage now where we're putting good practices into place on beaches and having large exclusion zones for colonies that pop up in locations that are not managed specifically for fairy terns. But certainly foxes and cats are a significant issue. So this season, Point Walter on the river was the only mainland site that was successful. All of the other sites were nearshore islands of Perth and, further up the coast. Oh, we did have a colony. We had 2 colonies on the lower south coast, which appear to have been successful. But in terms of the metro area, no successful breeding. And at the Point Walter site last season, we actually recorded fox prints, and out of 70 pairs, there were only 18 fledglings. So we had planned to go down and band the chicks, and we thought we'll just check out the site, make sure everything's going well. It had been a few days since I'd been there. And what we found was mass devastation. There were broken eggs everywhere. There were dead chicks. Most of the birds had left the area, and we found the fox prints. So we put that down to predation as well. This season on the mid-west coast, all the colonies were destroyed, we think, by foxes. So some cameras were put out and we found fox prints. So it looks like foxes were responsible there. We also have issues with cats. So you might have read last year or 2018 season that a cat was responsible for the loss of a colony down in Mandurah. So we had a colony there of about 220 birds or 110 nests, and over a number of nights a cat came and devastated the colony. So the cat ate several of the adults. We found the bodies of the adults, and I had documented the decline in the number of chicks and finding dead chicks. So, we think that potentially at least 40 individuals, mainly chicks. So it's not, it's significant and it's devastating, but losing breeding adults is, really, really devastating for the population.
What kind of management actions can be taken to reduce the impact of feral predators?
Yeah, so I guess this is a really, really important issue for fairy terns and other beach nesting birds because, they are exposed to these threats. In the lead up to the breeding season, predator control is really important. So the city of Mandurah, after that work, after my research there, and that we documented that the impact of the cat, the city of Mandurah actually changed their cat laws, and so they put into place a range of measures restricting cats from certain areas, as well as having the ability to make an individual cat a nuisance. And if that cat was found to be a nuisance, they could request that the cat be kept indoors for 21 days. And then obviously they started doing pre-breeding season predator control, so lots of trapping and trying to reduce any impacts from stray cats, as well as environmental education programs for cat owners to try and highlight, what we're trying to achieve and asking people to keep their cats indoors. So that's one thing. But cats, they're so difficult to be able to control, and the number of measures that we actually have available are pretty limited. So in metropolitan regions, you can't use certain, like 1080 baits, for example, you can't use those for foxes. The use of leg hold traps is not allowed. That's research only. You can only use those traps for research. So it really is. It comes down to trapping and education. Did
the work that the council did in response to the devastation that one cat had wreaked on the colony, has that been effective? Have you had any indication that that is working, and are people responding to the threat and keeping their cats inside?
Really interesting story. After my work down there, there's so much community support for fairy terns. I think before I started, a lot of people didn't really know what a fairy tern was. And a lot of people, because this was a managed site that has been created for these birds, and a lot of people were saying, oh, what do you think? They're just going to come here and nest here because you've made this area. And, they came and they nested there. And we had people coming down every single day to look through the scope. And all of a sudden they became our birds. And, it was a really exciting time for everybody. And, we had chicks in that colony. Those birds had been there for over a month and everything was going swimmingly. We thought it was going to be the most successful season for Mandurah for many decades. And so when the cat came, it created this outrage in the community. There were numerous newspaper articles. It was just crazy, the stuff that went on. We had people going down there at night overlooking the colony to make sure that that cat wasn't getting in there, and we thought the problem had been resolved, but unfortunately it wasn't. But that has created a whole flow-on effect for these birds. And I actually was approached by a news reporter probably late last year, and she said, I've been down in Mandurah and asking people, what matters to them, what do they want to talk about. And she said that so many people had been asking about the fairy terns and why they hadn't come back to Mandurah this year. So, the fact that the birds didn't nest there doesn't mean that they're not going to nest there again, but we've created this awareness, and I think that's a real opportunity to be able to move forward and, make sure that we've got people on our side, because, this is a coastal bird. They need as much support as they can get, because we all have a role to play while we're down on the coast.
Well, let's give the opportunity for some pats on the back for the people at the council. Well, it was the Mandurah Council, is that right?
It was the City of Mandurah, and they did a fantastic job this past breeding season getting the site ready. Lots of education. They did the trapping. Everything was perfect. They had done a lot of site maintenance there, ready for the terns. They did come. They had a look, but unfortunately they didn't nest there. So they did a great job, and it just goes to show that they are dedicated to making sure that we don't have these same issues in the future. And hopefully we'll see fairy terns back in Mandurah very soon.
Yeah, I hope so. Is there anyone at the council you want to give a special shout out to for their efforts?
Yeah, so I guess there's a whole team of people that were involved, but particularly the environmental section, a number of people there, Brent Brenchley and Rebecca Cassells. She's since moved on, but she was instrumental in making sure that everything was ready to go and getting that fairy tern sanctuary set up.
Hopefully some other councils around the country and other agencies that are managing the foreshores and the coastline in general can perhaps take a lesson from what's been being done. Oh, it must have been a really significant amount of resources that the Mandurah Council have put into it.
Yeah, that's right. They it would have been quite expensive. We did actually win a grant, so that was through a range of stakeholders: City of Mandurah, BirdLife, Conservation Council of WA, I think Hill Harvey Catchment Council. So there was a range of people that were involved in getting the fairy tern sanctuary together. Yeah, it's the managed sites idea is really important and something that we're looking at exploring further. And as part of my role in the Fairy Tern Network, we're working with a range of stakeholders. So not just, the conservation estate land managers. We've also got people working in ports, Department of Defence, local councils. So anywhere fairy terns are known to breed, we're trying to work with those people to ensure that we're putting measures in place to basically bolster reproductive success at those sites and doing, the trapping and all that type of stuff that needs to be done to ensure that these birds can have a successful season.
Sounds like there's a lot of cooperation going on that probably wouldn't have been quite so evident in the decades past. So that's probably greatly due to your efforts and I imagine the team at BirdLife WA.
Yeah, so my supervisor, Nick Dunlop, he was instrumental. This was his idea to set up the Fairy Tern network. And the network basically has three objectives. The first is to basically provide a platform for the sharing of information between land managers and the observers. Also to coordinate conservation actions between the different stakeholder groups, and then also to collect the digital records of the banded birds, which have allowed us to understand how those birds are moving in the landscape.
You've led beautifully into the next part of information that I wanted to get out of you. The records and the information that you are collecting, is it publicly available once you've got the observations down? And where will it mainly be used for? There's obviously your PhD project. What will be the outcome apart from the publication of your work?
Yeah, so this work is vitally important for understanding the population more broadly. So the information will be publicly available very soon, where hopefully it will be published.
Where will it be published, Claire?
So we've just submitted a paper to an international journal, and we've actually just had minor revisions come back. So we're pretty close to having that work finalised, and we'll then be able to share that to our networks and other people in the eastern states that are working on fairy terns. It's significant work because it shows how birds move around in the landscape. So we've got birds, obviously, that are occurring in certain regions, and that there's a large overlap between the different colonies. So birds are exchanging between the different breeding seasons.
Your PhD project began when, Claire?
So I started, actually today is the 2-year anniversary of my PhD. So I've been going for 2 years. So tomorrow I start year 3. It's been an amazing journey.
And it's slated to go for how long, and how have you been funding the work?
Yeah, so I'm hoping that I'll finish on time next year. So probably around June next year, I'll be handing in my thesis. It's been supported by a range of stakeholders. So firstly, BirdLife Australia and the Stuart Leslie Bird Award. Also the Ecological Society of Australia and the Holsworth Wildlife Research Endowment, as well as the Fremantle Ports. So I guess my work wouldn't be possible without them. But then I've also had some internal funding from Murdoch University. And then in terms of sustaining myself, I'm on an Australian scholarship, so I don't really need to work. I can just focus on my PhD, which has allowed me to spend essentially 8 months in the field collecting all this data that we can use to help inform conservation actions for this threatened species.
Well, at the 2-year point through your PhD, Claire, what do you think are the most significant pieces of information that you've discovered so far?
So there'll be a few. Firstly, it's been really nice to look at the natural history of this species. So there's never been any detailed studies that document all the various aspects of their breeding ecology. So looking at things like time to fledging, I did a study that looked at the incubation periods. We had some records from the eastern states, and they were birds from within little tern colonies, but only really small sample sizes. So I looked at time to hatching of 86 nests. I found that the median and mean time to hatching was 21 days, but there is also a bit of variation. I also found from my work in Mandurah that the birds were actually leaving the colony site at night. So the first birds to lay their eggs didn't incubate at night, and one of the birds did this for 9 nights. And amazingly, that egg hatched. Hatching was delayed by about 9 days, so the same time that they didn't incubate at night. So that suggests that these birds can go, relatively large periods without being, without having to incubate their eggs. And that, I guess, from a conservation perspective, that raises all sorts of questions and ideas about what you can do one of the things that they do in New Zealand, because some of the birds aren't laying fertile eggs, is that they transfer eggs between individuals. So if it ever got to the stage where you had to do the same thing in Australia, you could take eggs from one bird and give it to the next. And, if there was a period of time where that egg wasn't incubated because it had to be transported somewhere to another colony, it's possible in those early stages of the incubation period. I'm also looking at the diet of fairy terns, and I haven't yet examined the results in detail. I still have to go through and ID all the fish, but it's pretty apparent that there's a few main families of fish that the birds predominantly choose to catch, and they're the blue sprats. They're such an important component of the diet, as well as you've got the atharinids, which are another inshore schooling species, as well as a number of garfish and flying fish. And this season, particularly at Penguin Island, I documented that there were large numbers of tropical fish coming in. And so that kind of suggests that the food web in Western Australia, in the lower southwest, is changing. And I have spoken to research scientists that, this is their area of research, and they've looked at fish for many, many years. And they were actually quite surprised by some of these fish that were coming in. One of these species of garfish has never been recorded in this area. And another species of garfish, it's pretty rare for them to be here in such large numbers. So that's really important work. And the fact that you can look at fairy tern diet by, just watching what they bring back to colonies, it allows you to understand how the food web is functioning. To be able to go out and, do all those seine netting and catching small fishes would be very costly and time consuming. So having the birds do the work for you is a really interesting component of my study.
Sounds fascinating, being able to see the changes in the practical effects of the changing climate in such minute detail. Claire, I always like to know how they got into being a bird nerd. So tell us, when did you become aware that you were really interested in birds? Was it a result of your academic career, or were you a bird nerd from way back?
I wasn't always a bird nerd. I was always interested in the marine environment, and I guess that's been from a very, very early age. But I started volunteering. I was thinking about this earlier today. Must be about 13 years ago. I started volunteering at a wildlife shelter, and a lot of the work that I did was on birds. And then I started working up at the Black Cockatoo Conservation Centre, working with 3 endemic species of black cockatoos. And I guess through that work, it made me realise that I wasn't perhaps in the right field, and that kind of led me on my path to university. So in terms of what I'm doing now, I guess it all just fell into place, being able to fulfill my love of birds and also studying the marine environment.
Now, it's probably one of those questions that is going to answer itself, but do you have a favourite bird?
There's no denying that I love a good tern. Perhaps it's working in tern colonies. I've had the great privilege and pleasure to watch and spend many hours looking at sooty terns and bridal terns, and I think I couldn't go past a fairy tern, simply because you can't help but fall in love with a species that you have worked so closely with for several years. So I'll have to say the fairy tern, but there are definitely other birds which I have a really strong affinity for. I love the bridal terns as well. And I'm quite fascinated by the roseates. So hopefully in the future I can do some more work on those guys.
Now that leads to the next question, sometimes controversial, the answer to this one, Claire. What's the field guide of choice for Claire Greenwell?
Oh, I have a range of field guides, and I think you just can't use one. When I first started out, I had the birds of the Perth region. So that was a really good starter because it allowed me to focus on the birds that I knew about in my area. But now I use obviously the Australian Bird Guide. I have the Simpson and Day. I have a number of field guides because you can't always get the information from one. I do have both the apps on my phone, and I'm definitely using both, so I couldn't say one is better than the other.
That's a very good answer. I like that. I find that there isn't a one size fits all.
No.
Now, where's your favourite place to go birding?
Oh, that's a tough choice. I have to say that Dryandra Woodland is one of the most beautiful places, and I have some very fond memories with friends there. And actually, after I finish my PhD, I'm hoping to travel around Australia. So, ask me this question, in 2 years' time, I might say something different. But the South Coast and the southwest of Australia is so diverse, and I just love my little patch. And we have such a great mix of birds. So, yeah, I think it would be hard for me to go past the southwest. But once I expand my horizons, I might have a different opinion.
Now, if you're going to go on a great birding journey, and it sounds like that's in your near future, what's on your hit list? What's the bird you really want to go and see?
I don't know if I have a particular bird that I want to see. I'm really interested in seeing different habitats, and obviously that comes with seeing different types of birds. I think birding provides that opportunity where you can see lots of different places, because you think about birds, they all have their niche and they occupy such different areas. I'd love to say that, I'm going to go and see all the parrots, or I don't know. There's not one particular bird that I want to see, but I'm really excited about having that opportunity just to see a diverse mix of places. And, I haven't really done much travelling on the east coast of Australia, and I'm so excited about heading to far north Queensland. So, yeah, I'm really looking forward to that.
What about the wampu pigeon?
Oh, yes. There's so many birds that I'd love to see. Yeah.
I don't think I really need to ask you whether you're an immersive, experiential birder or a ticker and flicker. I think you're not a ticker and flicker.
No, for me, it's not about ticking and flicking. I went a while back and did some ground parrot surveys on the south coast of Australia, and one of the people there said to me, "Oh, so you're just here to get another tick?" And I just think that's not me. I'm here to, get involved in the conservation of this species, which few people now have the opportunity to be able to work with. So anything that I can do to help improve outcomes for this bird would be fantastic. So definitely not there to get a tick. And I didn't see the bird, but I did hear it.
It's a pretty special one if you see an eastern ground parrot, and especially amazing if you happen to see a western ground parrot. But same thing. I've heard them. I've heard them, but I haven't seen them.
I think it's just amazing to be in that environment and to hear them and to know that they're still there. Okay, I didn't get to see the bird, but it was still an amazing experience.
Yeah, and it can be a pretty bleak kind of habitat that they hang out in. So I felt the same. Having a campfire after hearing them, travelling a long way to go somewhere where I knew they were.
Yeah,
was a lot of fun. Really rewarding just to hear. It's a pretty unusual noise too.
Definitely, yeah.
Well, Claire, I think we're just about done. Where do you see yourself when the Fairy Tern work is done and you can hand over to the next Claire? Where do you see yourself going in your academic pursuits?
Yeah, I'd love to stay in pure research. I have no interest in fulfilling an academic career, but I guess being able to answer questions that are of interest to me, but also of really high conservation value, is something that I'd like to continue. There's a number of bird species here that need to be studied, and there's very few people working on seabirds. So I'd love to keep working in seabirds, but I guess I'll just have to see if I can get some funding, maybe look at doing a postdoc once I've done a bit of travel. Yeah.
Well,
I'm pretty flexible and open to ideas if anybody has anything.
I hope that all works out well. Look, Claire, it's been a great delight, really, to meet you over the airwaves, and I hope that our little chat really does raise the awareness amongst the general public to the fairy tern and the plight of the fairy tern. And hopefully the people, when they plan their next four-wheel driving camping trip, really think about what driving on a beach can really mean.
Yeah.
And that for all those fruit growers and vegetable growers and pastoralists along the Murray and the Darling systems can understand that what they're doing can affect a tiny little bird that's flitting around the southern, eastern and western coasts of Australia. So thanks again, Claire, and I really hope that we get the opportunity to talk about seabirds sometime more in the future.
Thank you so much for having me on the show, Grant. It's been such a privilege and a pleasure.
I hope you really enjoyed meeting Claire and hearing about her work, and I'm sure you join me in wishing her well and good luck in the photography competition that I mentioned at the start of the episode. If you know someone who deserves an honourable mention, or if you deserve one yourself, if you've just been published, got a job, graduated, finished a long project after many years of hard work, you can let me know and you can be in the honour roll, or someone you know can be in the honour roll. To do that, just send an email to news@thebirdemergency.com, or tweet at me or send a DM on Twitter @birdemergency. We've got a couple of great episodes coming up. We're going to learn about the red goshawk, we're going to learn about the 40-spotted pardalote, and we're going to learn about the plains wanderer. Thanks to those who have sent me some really encouraging messages and some nice feedback about the episode so far. If you like what I've been doing, I'd love to know. You can review the podcast or just send me a message, news@thebirdemergency.com. That would really make my day. I look forward to joining you again shortly on the next instalment of The Bird Emergency.